There's a specific kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It's the loneliness of sitting in a room full of people, hearing every word they're saying, understanding the language perfectly, and still feeling like you're receiving a broadcast from a completely different station than the one everyone else is tuned to. You laugh when they laugh, you nod when they nod, but underneath, something in you registers that the conversation you're actually having, the one happening inside your body, behind your eyes, in the place where meaning lives, has almost nothing to do with what's being spoken out loud. Jung spent much of his life studying people who carried this particular kind of isolation. Not the isolation of rejection or social failure, but something stranger and harder to name. These were people whose inner experience operated on a different wavelength than the world around them. Their perception was deeper. Their relationship to meaning was more intense. Their need for authenticity was so fierce, it made ordinary social participation feel like wearing a suit made of someone else's skin. And what fascinated Jung was that these people weren't broken. They weren't disordered. They were, in his framework, further along in the process of becoming psychologically real than most of the population would ever go. He would have called what they were experiencing a natural consequence of individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are beneath the masks, the roles, the inherited beliefs, and the comfortable lies. And he recognized that this process doesn't make life easier. It makes life more honest, more vivid, more meaningful, and profoundly more isolating. Because the deeper you go into your own psyche, the fewer people can follow you there. Today, I'm going to walk you through 7 signs that your inner life is operating at a depth most people genuinely cannot access. Not because they're lesser, but because they haven't been pulled into the depths the way you have. These aren't personality quirks or spiritual badges. They're markers Jung observed in people whose consciousness had crossed a threshold that changes everything about how you experience being alive. And if you recognize yourself in these signs, you'll finally have language for something you've probably been carrying alone for a very long time. The first sign is that superficial social interaction feels physically uncomfortable to you, not just boring, but almost unbearable. Most people experience small talk as neutral. It's the background hum of social life. You ask how someone's weekend was. They tell you about a restaurant. You nod. They ask about yours. Nobody's lying exactly, but nobody's telling the truth either. For most people, this exchange costs nothing. For you, it costs something real. People deep in the individuation process developed what Jung described as an allergy to inauthenticity. Not arrogance, not a sense of being above it. Something closer to a physical intolerance, like the psyche had become sensitized to the gap between what people were saying and what was actually happening underneath. You sit through a dinner party and you can feel the performances, the careful curation, the way people arrange their words to maintain a version of themselves that everyone has silently agreed to accept. And you're exhausted afterward, not because you're introverted, but because your nervous system is processing the distance between surface and substance in every single interaction. You're registering what's being said and what's being hidden at the same time, and the contradiction takes a toll that no one around you seems to feel. They walk away energized. You walk away like you've been swimming upstream for 3 hours. This isn't social anxiety. It's what happens when your consciousness has started operating at a depth that makes surface-level exchange feel like trying to breathe through a cloth. The second sign is that your inner life is more vivid and more real to you than your outer circumstances. You dream in symbols that stay with you for days. You catch yourself staring out windows not because you're distracted, but because something inside is assembling meaning from fragments you can't quite articulate yet. You have moments, in the shower, driving, lying awake at 3 in the morning, where something rises from deep inside your psyche and rearranges your understanding of your own life. And those moments feel more significant to you than most of what happens in the external world. Jung was fascinated by people like this. He recognized that certain individuals had an unusually porous boundary between their conscious mind and what he called the unconscious, that vast, ancient reservoir of imagery, memory, instinct, and archetypal pattern that lives beneath waking awareness. For most people, the unconscious stays underground. It sends up occasional dreams that get forgotten by breakfast. It influences behavior in ways the person never recognizes. But for some people, that boundary thins. The unconscious starts speaking louder. Symbols become meaningful. Coincidences start carrying weight. The inner world stops being background noise and becomes the primary landscape of experience. This doesn't mean you're delusional or disconnected from reality. It means your psyche is doing something that Jung considered essential but rare. It's integrating material from the depths. You're in active dialogue with parts of yourself that most people never meet. The images that visit you, the dreams that won't leave you alone, the feelings that arise without obvious cause. These aren't random. They're your unconscious trying to communicate. And the fact that you're listening, that you can't not listen, is one of the clearest signs that your consciousness is operating at a frequency most people will go their entire lives without tuning into. The third sign is that you perceive what people are hiding, often before you have any logical reason to know it's there. Someone smiles at you and something in your gut registers that the smile is a wall, not an opening. Someone tells you they're doing well and you feel the sadness they haven't acknowledged even to themselves. You meet someone new and within minutes you have an impression of their inner landscape that you couldn't possibly explain to anyone else. And that impression turns out to be accurate weeks or months later when the truth finally surfaces. Jung documented this pattern extensively. He noticed that people undergoing deep psychological development seemed to gain a perceptual sharpness that went far beyond normal social intelligence. They weren't reading body language in any ordinary sense. They were perceiving the structure underneath, the defense mechanisms, the compensations, the shadow material leaking through the cracks of someone's carefully managed persona. He would have called this a function of heightened unconscious processing. Your psyche is taking in vast amounts of information that your conscious mind doesn't register. Micro-expressions, tonal shifts, energetic inconsistencies, the particular way someone's words don't quite match their eyes. And it's assembling that data into a picture that arrives in your awareness as a feeling rather than a thought. The problem is that this perception isolates you. You see what others don't, and when you try to name what you're seeing, people either don't believe you or feel exposed and turn hostile. So you learn to keep quiet. You develop the habit of knowing things you can never say. And over time, this creates a strange kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of having no one around, but the loneliness of seeing clearly in a room full of people who are committed to not seeing. You start to wonder if something's wrong with you, if you're paranoid, judgmental, projecting. But then what you perceived keeps proving accurate, again and again, and you realize the problem isn't your perception. The problem is that your perception doesn't have company. The fourth sign is that solitude doesn't just feel comfortable, it feels necessary for your survival. Not in a dramatic way, not as escape or avoidance, but in the way that breathing feels necessary. Something in you requires regular immersion in silence and aloneness, the way a deep-sea creature requires pressure. Without it, you start to lose yourself. Your edges blur. Other people's emotions, opinions, and energy start bleeding into your own until you can't tell where you end and they begin. Solitude served a profoundly different function for people in active individuation than it did for the general population. For most people, solitude is a break from social life. For people whose psyche is doing deep work, solitude is where the real work happens. It's where the unconscious has room to speak, where the symbols can surface without being drowned out by external noise, where the self, not the persona, not the role, not the mask, can breathe and take shape. This is why you feel restored by being alone in a way that confuses people who care about you. They see you retreating and assume something's wrong. They interpret your need for solitude as withdrawal, depression, or rejection. But you know the truth, that the hours you spend alone aren't empty. They're the fullest hours of your life. Something is happening in that silence. You can feel it reorganizing you, settling you back into alignment, returning you to a frequency that gets scrambled every time you spend too long in environments that operate at a depth you've outgrown. And here's the part that makes this sign especially difficult. The world doesn't value solitude. It values productivity, connection, visibility, engagement. So your most essential need, the thing that keeps you psychologically intact, gets treated as a problem to solve rather than a capacity to protect. You end up defending your alone time like it's a guilty habit instead of recognizing it for what it is, the practice that keeps your consciousness clear enough to function at the depth you're built for. The fifth sign is one that costs you more than any of the others. You are drawn to truth even when truth is painful, even when it would be easier and more pleasant to look away. You'd rather know the real state of a relationship than maintain a comfortable illusion. You'd rather face your own flaws than hide behind a curated self-image. You'd rather sit with an ugly reality than be soothed by a beautiful lie. And this orientation toward truth isn't something you chose, it chose you. Something in your psyche simply won't let you rest inside a deception, even when the deception would make your life significantly easier. Jung understood this impulse as a hallmark of the individuating psyche. He observed that people who were genuinely doing the work of becoming conscious developed an almost involuntary honesty, not just with others but with themselves. Their tolerance for self-deception decreased as their awareness increased. They could no longer maintain the comfortable stories most people use to get through the day. The story that their marriage was fine, that their career reflected their values, that their family dynamics were normal, that they were happy. Once consciousness reaches a certain depth, those stories start dissolving, and what's left underneath isn't always pleasant. This is what Jung meant when he talked about confronting the shadow. It's not a weekend workshop exercise. It's the ongoing daily willingness to see yourself as you actually are, rather than as you wish you were. To acknowledge the jealousy, the pettiness, the selfishness, the fear. To recognize that you're capable of everything you've ever judged in someone else. And this willingness, this inability to look away from your own darkness, is what separates people operating at psychological depth from people who are still fully identified with their persona. But this orientation toward truth comes at a steep social cost, because most relationships, most social systems, most families run on a shared agreement to not look too closely, to maintain the surface, to keep the uncomfortable truths underground where they can't disrupt the performance. And when you can't participate in that agreement, when something in you keeps pulling the thread, keeps asking the real question, keeps naming the thing everyone else has decided to ignore, you become a threat. Not because you're aggressive or confrontational, but because your mere presence in a room full of performances reminds people that they're performing. And most people would rather lose you than face that. If you've been doing this kind of inner work, sitting with hard truths, peeling back the layers of your own psychology, feeling the weight of what honesty actually demands, then you already know it's not something that happens once and resolves. It's an ongoing process, and sometimes it helps to have something structured to anchor that process. The guide we put together, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jungian principles, designed to meet you in the depth you're already operating at. If that resonates, the link is right below this video. The sixth sign is that you have been broken open by suffering in a way that fundamentally reorganized who you are. Not just difficult experiences, not just hard seasons. Something happened, or a series of things happened, that shattered whatever version of yourself you'd been living as, and forced you to rebuild from raw material. And the person who emerged from that destruction doesn't resemble the person who went in. Not because you lost yourself, but because you found parts of yourself that could only be reached through breaking. Jung never romanticized suffering. He didn't believe pain was inherently good or spiritually necessary in some cosmic sense. But he observed, over and over, that the people who achieved genuine psychological depth had almost always been through periods of intense inner crisis. He called these experiences encounters with the unconscious. Moments when the carefully constructed conscious identity collapsed under the weight of what had been repressed, denied, or never integrated. Depression that didn't respond to surface solutions. Anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere. Relationships that imploded. Identities that stopped working. A sense that the life you'd built was someone else's life, and you'd been sleepwalking through it. These crises, Jung found, weren't breakdowns in the way the world uses that word. They were breakthroughs happening in the only language the unconscious knows: disruption. The psyche was forcing a confrontation with material that the conscious mind had been refusing to face. And the people who went through these crises without medicating them away, without spiritually bypassing them, without fleeing back into the comfort of the old persona. Those people emerged different. Not healed in the clean, finished sense, but deepened, expanded, more real, more capable of sitting with the full range of human experience without flinching. If you've been through something like this, you know it didn't feel like growth while it was happening. It felt like annihilation, like everything you understood about yourself was being dismantled, with no guarantee that anything would replace it. But something did replace it, something quieter and more solid, something that didn't need external validation to feel real. And that something is the part of you that now vibrates at a frequency most people can't access, because most people have never been forced to go that deep. The seventh sign is the one Jung considered most essential to everything he studied. You feel a powerful, almost gravitational pull to become who you actually are. Not who your family wanted you to be, not who your culture rewards you for being, not who would make your life easiest or most socially acceptable. Something in you refuses to settle into a borrowed identity. You've tried, you've worn the roles, you've played the parts, and every time something inside you started dying. Not dramatically, quietly, like a signal slowly fading because the receiver was being forced to tune to the wrong station. Jung called this pull individuation, and he considered it the central task of a meaningful human life. Individuation isn't about becoming perfect or enlightened. It's about becoming psychologically real. It means withdrawing the projections you've placed on others. It means integrating the shadow material you've been hiding from. It means dismantling the persona, the socially acceptable mask, and discovering who exists underneath it. And it means accepting that the person underneath might not be who anyone expected or wanted you to be. This process is terrifying because it requires you to disappoint people, to outgrow relationships that were built on the old version of you, to leave systems that depend on you staying small, compliant, predictable, to say no to paths that look right from the outside but feel dead from the inside. Jung observed that people in the grip of individuation often went through periods of intense conflict with their families, their partners, their communities, not because they were being rebellious, but because the person they were becoming could no longer fit inside the container the old person had occupied. And here's what makes this sign so disorienting. The world doesn't have a framework for what you're going through. There's no socially recognized category for, I'm in the process of becoming psychologically real, and it's costing me everything. So you look around for mirrors, for someone who understands, and mostly you find people who think you're having a midlife crisis, or being selfish, or losing your mind. They don't have language for individuation because they've never been called into it. They're still fully identified with their persona, their role, their social position. And from inside that identification, what you're doing looks like self-destruction rather than self-creation. But Jung was clear about this. The pull toward individuation isn't optional for the people who feel it. You can resist it. You can medicate it. You can distract yourself from it for years. But it doesn't go away. It's the self, Jung's term for the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, calling you toward wholeness. And ignoring that call doesn't make it stop. It just makes the gap between who you're performing and who you actually are grow wider and more painful until something finally breaks. Now here's what matters about recognizing these 7 signs in yourself. This isn't about claiming a special identity or announcing to the world that you operate at a higher frequency. Jung would have been deeply suspicious of anyone who wore psychological depth as a badge. The moment you turn individuation into a persona, I'm the deep one, the aware one, the one who sees, you've replaced one mask with another. The shadow of depth is spiritual superiority, and Jung saw it consume people who mistook self-awareness for self-completion. What these signs actually mean, practically, is that your life requires different things than most people's lives require. You need more solitude than is socially comfortable. You need more honesty than most relationships can tolerate. You need more meaning than most careers provide. You need more psychological reality than most social environments allow. And the gap between what you need and what the world offers is the source of that particular loneliness you've been carrying, the one that doesn't go away no matter how many people you're surrounded by. Jung's framework doesn't eliminate that loneliness, But it does something almost as valuable. It explains it. It tells you that you're not broken, you're not too sensitive, you're not failing at being a normal human. You're in the middle of a psychological process that most people never enter, and that the ones who do enter rarely have words for. The frequency you're operating at isn't better than anyone else's. It's just different in a way that makes ordinary life feel like it's happening in a language you understand, but no longer speak as your first tongue. And the path forward, according to everything Jung spent his life documenting, isn't to force yourself back to a frequency that feels comfortable to others. It's to go deeper into your own, to trust the inner life that feels more real than your outer circumstances, to honor the solitude that restores you, to follow the pull toward authenticity even when it costs you belonging, to let the suffering you've been through mean something by allowing it to make you more whole rather than more guarded. This doesn't mean you withdraw from the world entirely. Jung wasn't advocating for hermitage, he was advocating for conscious engagement, being in the world without being consumed by its surfaces, participating in relationships, work, community, but from a place of psychological honesty rather than performance, finding the rare people who can meet you at depth, building a life that reflects who you actually are rather than who you've been pretending to be. This is slow work. It doesn't happen through a single realization or a weekend retreat. It happens through the daily, unglamorous practice of being honest with yourself about what you see, what you feel, and what you need. The signal you're carrying, that frequency that makes you feel out of step with everyone around you, isn't a malfunction. It's the sound of a psyche doing the most important work a human being can do, the work of becoming real. Jung spent his entire career studying people who heard that signal and had the courage to follow it instead of drowning it out. And what he found consistently was that the people who followed it didn't end up happier in any simple sense. They ended up more alive, more present to their own existence, more capable of genuine connection, not with everyone, but with the rare others who had also gone deep enough to hear the same frequency. That's what's happening to you. Not a disorder, not a deficiency, not a problem to solve, a depth to honor. And the loneliness that comes with it, the ache of being tuned to a station most people will never find, that loneliness is the price of the signal. Jung would tell you the signal is worth the price. Not because the loneliness gets easier, but because what the signal gives you, clarity, depth, psychological truth, the slow becoming of who you actually are, is the only thing that's ever felt like home. If the 7 signs we walk through today felt like they were describing something you've been living but couldn't name, the work doesn't stop with recognition. It deepens from here. True Self-Discovery, our guide built around 24 Jungian reflection exercises, was created for people at exactly this stage. Not beginners looking for theory, but people already in the process, looking for structured ways to go further. The link is just below.